At 510 peeps, this is module 3, and this module contains some philosophical musings, and so I'm going to get right into it and try to get it done in 15 minutes. So first of all, we're going to use some terms like ontology, epistemology, and methodology. These are going to become part of your lexicon, and I want to say right off the bat that we should be on the lookout in our own writing and the writing of others for things that sound like people know things. Because in the world of educational research especially, most researchers won't say they absolutely know the truth about something. They won't claim something's true or proven because there's just not enough evidence to say 100% that that's going to be true. So people in this field will often, and even in the if you listen to real scientists, they will seldom say that too. They'll say things like, well, we can be fairly certain that, and so that's called hedging, and you'll see that in the writing that you read, and you should also do it in your own writing, just so that we know that just because you say it or you have some data to back up your claims does not necessarily mean that something is true or that you found some kind of universal truth about the world. That said, we do have these three terms, and they are the underpinnings of any research, and educational researchers especially like to acknowledge that these things are operating, even if they're operating under the surface and aren't really talked about too much. So ontology is your perspective about the world. Are you a realist? Do you think that there's really objects out there, that there's really something called school, that everything that we see is exactly as we observe it? Or do you think that sometimes these things are in the eye of the beholder? What's school to one person might not be school to somebody else, for example. Epistemology is about how we know what we know. How do we know if something is school? How do we determine that? What rules do we use? Whose society has made those rules, for example? And methodology is how would we go out finding out the answer to that question about what is school? And it's actually a harder question than you think it might be, right? So these systematic ways of finding these things out. So you might call it a case study or an ethnography. And then, of course, we have methods. And methods are something that's located within a methodology. So you might study people in a certain school system, but you study them by interviewing them or surveying them. And the interviews or surveys are the methods. And so that's the difference between methodology and methods, often confused. All of these ideas about the way we know things in the world could be considered to be part of a paradigm. And you've probably heard that before, but it comes from kind of the philosophy of science. Thomas Kuhn, in his 1977 book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, great book, very easy reading for a philosopher actually, recounts how science has changed over the time, even the last few hundred years, where over a long period of time, people kind of subscribe to the same ideas. They all kind of agree on things. So for example, when Isaac Newton came and proposed his laws of motion, everybody said, yep, they all work. We're going to do these calculations. We can make things like airplanes with them and they'll fly. But then somebody might come along and have another idea and say, okay, well, that works in those situations. But if we want a theory that actually accounts better for what's happening in the world, we might want to go with Einstein and his theory of relativity. And so the whole physics community was kind of upended by this because they had all these things that they couldn't explain using Newtonian physics. They had anomalies, and those anomalies were incommensurable with the theories they had already. In other words, they were not aligning. And so they had to get a new paradigm. And so this new paradigm came about with lots of struggle, and people would disparage the scientists that subscribed to the new paradigm, which often happens, until it became, again, what we might call normal science. Everybody kind of accepts it, and then you go on to the next paradigm shift. So that's the theory, and I think in many cases it does apply to educational research as well. So what do we consider good or acceptable as research in the educational community? Well, recently, in the last 30 years or so, we have undergone a bit of a paradigm shift. And so I'd like to talk to you about that for just a minute. So was it sudden and disruptive? Well, it was fairly sudden. It kind of happened in the late 1960s, early 1970s, and it was a shift from positivism towards constructivism. Most faculties of education worldwide now would probably call themselves more constructivist. That doesn't mean that there's not positivistic research going on in them, and that positivism is not a force to be reckoned with, especially in quantitative research circles. But positivism is this idea that everything can be understood by making observations, fitting them into a set of logical suppositions, and even mathematically proving them. Very scientific. Of course, I am a science teacher. I do have very positive ways of thinking about the world. I do believe in the power of science to reveal things about the world. But I myself have shifted in the years that I've been doing research over my master's and PhD to a more constructivist stance. So this is that individuals or learners do not acquire knowledge and understanding by passively perceiving it. So the idea of delivering to a vessel, right? You get filled up with knowledge from a teacher, but instead you construct new ideas. And I'm sure you've seen this in your undergrad work, where the idea is you have a bunch of ideas and you have to fit the new ideas into your pre-existing ideas, or you have to kind of break your pre-existing conceptions or your preconceptions in order to get new ideas in there that work better. And of course, this is in our science education classes, we talk about breaking misconceptions for students. So this is very powerful in the social sciences, especially because when you think about it, proving that there's, that you can split an atom versus proving that there's such a thing as school, or if school is good for students, are questions that both can be researched, but maybe the stance required might have to be a little bit different in those cases. So positivism in education was the standard for research through most of the first part of the 20th century, and then it went through a shift in kind of the 1970s where people started saying, well, numbers don't tell the whole story in education. Just measuring things often doesn't tell you why or how things are working. So if you measure something in a classroom, maybe like exam scores, for example, maybe that atomizes what's happening there, and you're not really finding out why students are not able to do math, for example. And even in measuring it, the measurements you're making probably have some values attached to them. What do you value in terms of students' ability to do math? Do you value that they can do the quadratic equation, or that they can do math in their head? Or is there something else that that test is valuing over other things? And probably most importantly for you, everybody looks through a lens when they view their research area. And that lens can it's always biased, but the more you realize you're biased and talk about it, the more you're able to mitigate the effects of that bias. So for example, you could look at a situation where you're measuring math scores and you think that you have a constructivist way of looking at the world, and you think that the way to deal with that would be to help students construct new ideas. And so you go at it with that lens, and that might make your research questions and your research methodologies quite different than if you come at it from a different angle, so to speak. So think about the lens that you view your research question through. This is a classic book. I have a copy of this. It's out of print now. But Guba and Lincoln were kind of the pioneers of this and still have some of the most convincing arguments about this. This book was absolutely seminal, and I still use it all the time to look up terms like trustworthiness, for example, and how they talk about this instead of reliability and validity that a scientific study might have. They'll talk about something called trustworthiness, and there's a little bit different criteria for quality of educational research as a result of shifting from the positivist to the constructivist perspective. You'll do some of these readings in this module, and I hope you find them interesting. This was a paradigm shift, and so Greenfield and Griffith, for example, were two researchers that actually got in a fight at a conference, a very loud, raucous fight, and they were taking these different stances. Greenfield was a U of A professor, actually, and Griffith was a quantitative researcher, and Greenfield was more constructivist in his approach, and Greenfield got kind of raked over the coals for his research and what he was doing, which is typical for a paradigm shift. And yet, today, most educational research is constructivist in nature, so much so that now they don't even often talk about it when they're introducing a research study, because it's somewhat implied in many cases, not always. So is this a spectrum? Well, it's a bit of an artificial kind of putting things into holes here, but you could say positivism, or this kind of scientific worldview, is at one end, and constructivism maybe at the other end. There's actually something called radical constructivism, that maybe nothing actually does exist in the world, kind of Matrix-like. But we won't go into that. You can look it up if you like. But in between, there's post-positivism, which is a situation where they say, well, you can think you know something about the world, but that can shift as you find out new things. And then there's critical theory, fascinating areas here like feminism, where you actually, or emancipatory research, where you look at the world through the eyes of people who have been kind of trod upon, who have been repressed over time, and you look at ways to help them to free themselves from these restrictive structures, for example. So there's different ways of doing this kind of research, and there's different kinds of paradigms. I won't spend too much time on that, because I think we can just talk about another paradigm that has really come to the fore, especially in Canada here lately, which I think is really promising, and that's the Indigenous perspectives paradigm. Here you can see me here at the bottom. This is land-based learning that we've been doing over the last couple of years with teachers. And as I've come to understand this more, and I hope you understand it a little bit better as you do the readings by Dwayne Donald and Evelyn Steinhauer, both of which are very respected colleagues of mine that I've worked with, and absolutely love their work and their ideas. Their ideas of things like two-eyed seeing and métissage, and their ability to write about them in this Western way through papers, because many of our Indigenous knowledge keepers don't love writing academic papers, so these are treasures. They allow you to see the world through another lens, another worldview, and maybe it's something you might want to take up in your own work. So there's some ideas about paradigms and about ways of knowing about the world, some philosophy for you. So what do you need to do? Well, I think you need to think about this a little bit as you read the readings for this week. Are you a constructivist? Do you think that you can use some of the ideas from Indigenous worldviews in your work? If you can, think hard about how that might intersect with what you're doing, and maybe even read a little bit more by authors that are doing some of that work, and then just think. Just go for a walk and let these ideas wash over you, and how you might want to proceed with your research, and how you're actually viewing the world, and how that's altering the way you're asking questions about it. I know that's a little bit out there, but it is what we do in Module 3, and so we're going to think about that. You're going to do a little bit of a discussion forum in this module, and we're working towards that annotated bibliography, and I'll do another instructional video about the annotated bibliography and what we're looking for there, and how some of these ideas tie into that. So have a great day, and I managed to do that in just over 14 minutes. Can't really believe it. And if you have any questions, please let me know. Okay, bye-bye.